Good morning and welcome to our Patent Literacy Symposium and this session, Inference, Multiple Contributions to Comprehension. My name is Karen Deary and I'm joined this morning by my colleague, Lisa Coleman-Bola. We're excited to facilitate this session for everyone, but before we start, we have just a few housekeeping items to review. You can access the presenter handouts for this session, the presenter bio, and the conference schedule on the Patent website, and the link is provided in the chat for you. Just as a reminder, this session is being recorded and is 75 minutes in length, which includes a 15-minute question and answer period at the end. So please share your questions that you have in the chat box, and we will collect those and share those with our presenter. To access closed captioning, click on the icon CC Live Transcript on the Zoom control panel. If you experience technology difficulties, please go to the Technical Support Guides area above the schedule on the symposium page. Please keep your video feature off and stay muted to eliminate any potential distractions during the presentation portion of our session. We would love for you to tweet out about all of the information that you're learning on social media this week. So please use hashtag PatentLit2022 to share all of that. And now it's my pleasure and my honor to welcome and introduce to you our presenter for this morning, Nancy Hennessy. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Lisa. I want to express my gratitude to Pam Kastner and her incredible literacy team at Patent, and of course to Patent itself, for providing such valuable resource for all of us who recognize that learning is our work and that we need to continue and add to what it is that we already know. So I'm here this morning with you as a teacher, a fellow educator. I don't consider myself an expert, but rather a learner. So we'll learn together this morning. I'm going to share with you some of what I have learned over the past several years about comprehension initially, and then of course, the focus for today, inference. So I tweaked the title a little bit, you might have noticed, multiple contributors and connections to comprehension. And I'm going to be talking about how we go about constructing that comprehension house that you see in the lower right-hand corner. What are the major frameworks? What are the major beams that we need to have in place in order to build this particular house, in order to construct meaning? I also, before I begin, want to say this to you. I want to honor what it is that you've brought to this discussion this morning. I know that all of us have been learning over the last several years and acquiring the science of reading. So honoring what it is that you do, encouraging you to continue to do what is effective, but also to be thinking about where do you have to change course a little bit. And thinking about how you might do that within the context in which you work. So creating the conditions by considering the context, creating the conditions for comprehension. Throughout, I'll pose a series of questions that will relate then to what our topics will be. So we're going to begin by thinking a little bit about this connection to reading comprehension. So I'm going to encourage you to use your PowerPoint handout. Also, from time to time, I'm going to reference your participant guide so that you can interact a bit more with the content. But for now, just be thinking to yourself, what do you know about reading comprehension and this inference connection? And I think that one of the things that is important for us to convey is, while we're focused on inference this morning, comprehension is far more complex and complicated than that. So let's take a look at where inference sits within this whole process of extracting and constructing meaning. And to do that, we can certainly turn to a description of comprehension from Castles and colleagues. This is a description that I consistently use when I talk about comprehension. And she and our colleagues remind us that it's not a single entity. So inference is a contributor, but not the whole package. So it's not a single entity that can be explained by a unified cognitive model. Complex, I think, as Katz and Cami have said, one of the most complex behaviors we engage in as individuals, as human beings. So what do we mean about it being complex? And then where does inference fit? And we all are familiar with the simple view of reading, I'm sure, decoding times by linguistic comprehension, or more recently, word recognition times by language comprehension. And we know that not so simple. And in fact, Hoover and Tunmer, in a recent publication, surfaced for us an elaboration on the simple view. And I want you to just take a look at this for a moment. On the right-hand side, what you certainly see are those skill sets, the knowledge that contributes to word recognition. But on the left-hand side, what we see here is language comprehension. And they speak to linguistic knowledge, different systems of language that contribute, but look at what else they speak to: background knowledge and inferencing skills. So a part of, one of the contributors to, but all working in concert with one another in order to achieve reading comprehension, right? We also can be thinking a bit about other cognitive models, as well as this visual metaphor that Hollis Scarborough has provided. So if we look at the reading systems framework, Perfetti and Strafora, and of course we know that Chuck Perfetti is best known for the lexical quality hypothesis. So sitting right here in the middle is that lexicon, the importance of word meaning and how it contributes. But they really, he speaks to, along with his colleagues, two systems of knowledge, both a linguistic and a writing system, and then goes further in talking about the orthographic system and the linguistic system and what are the components. And again, I want you to note that while we certainly acknowledge the importance of word recognition, our focus is comprehension. And when he speaks and his colleagues speak to comprehension processes, what do we see? We see inferences again, and inferences playing a great deal, having a great deal of importance in terms of text representation, and then something called the situation model. We'll get there. We're going to talk some more about it. If we take a look at the visual metaphor that Hollis Scarborough has given us for skilled reading, and we look at the upper strands of the rope, the language comprehension strands of the rope, we see verbal reasoning. And again, I want to continue to emphasize for all of you that it is not just one skill or strategy that makes for comprehension. It is the connections between, it is the reciprocal nature of, it is this interrelatedness of these multiple linguistic and cognitive processes that allow for us to comprehend, to make meaning. So here we have verbal reasoning, and note that inference is included. All right. So complex and complicated comprehension, and certainly inference being one of the critical contributors to the extracting and constructing of meaning. So now let's go a little bit further and let's think a little bit about the reader. All right, let's ask ourselves the question, what do we know about how the reader constructs meaning and the role of inference in constructing meaning? We've just seen it in terms of theoretical models and that wonderful visual metaphor. But what else might we consider? And again, I'm going to turn to the Castles and colleagues' description of comprehension, in which they talk about comprehension being the orchestrated product. So an orchestrated product. So the product has everything to do with what it is that the student is able to do. You know, how they go about demonstrating, either orally or in writing, their understanding of the text that they're reading. But how do they get to that product? And what Castles and colleagues tell us is they get to that product through what? Through a set of linguistic and cognitive processes. So as I've said in my writing about comprehension, the Reading Comprehension Blueprint, that high quality products are the result of high quality processes. So when we begin to think about these processes, again, we can turn to the science, we can turn to the evidence, and we can turn, in this case, to the work of Kane and Oakhill to understand what are the linguistic processes that go into the making of meaning. And again, we're going to be looking for how does inference play into this? So I'm going to give you just a moment to take a look at and to read, all right, what is represented here, the words of Kane and Oakhill. Just take a moment and read to yourself. So as you're reading this, I'm sure you're recognizing some of those instructional components that we focus on as educators. They need to access the meaning of, well, that has everything to do with vocabulary. They need to work out what that syntactic structure, right? And the meaning of sentence, right? That's sentence comprehension, right? But what Kane and Oakhill tell us is that's not enough to get where we want to go in terms of comprehension. In order to have this overall understanding, this big picture understanding, then what has to happen is the reader, the comprehender, has to integrate the information within and between different sentences. This is a type of inference that we'll be talking about later today, or this morning, I should say. All right, to establish what is called local coherence. In other words, how the ideas hang together at a particular level of understanding. But they also talk about the fact that we need to be able to, the reader, incorporate background knowledge to make sense of things that are implicitly mentioned. So here, again, we're referencing what? Inference. And this is inference in terms of making connections with topical knowledge, for instance, in order to arrive at this overall understanding of what it is that we're reading. So inference, again, playing a role, but in conjunction with these other levels of language processing. And the last part of the description that Castles and colleagues have provided us with is the following. Operating on text and interacting with background knowledge, features of the text, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation. So not a single entity, all right, product, all right, result of process. And then bringing forward this idea that we have to consider, and some of you are probably thinking Rand Reading Study Group report, the role of the text, different genre, different levels of difficulty, the academic language of the text, all right, purpose and goals of the reading situation. What is it that we're asking our students to do? We're asking them to move through what? Different levels of understanding, all right? And when we ask them to move through different levels of understanding, right, we can think about it in this way. We ask them to work with the vocabulary in the sentences, the exact words, all right? And in this case, I'm making a connection to what? A selection from the book, The One and Only Ivan. Perhaps some of you have used that book with your students around 4th or 5th grade. All right, and it's the story of a gorilla who lives in a particular type of zoo. I won't go there just yet. We'll infer what type of zoo that is in a few moments. But thinking through that selection, that brief paragraph, and then thinking about, what's the purpose? What are the goals of reading? Well, if we're working at the surface level or with the surface code, we're just working at the literal level of understanding. What is his domain made of? And we can go right to the text to answer that. But if we're working in the text space, then we have to begin to think about the derived meaning of the idea units. And, words contribute to idea units, and then idea units are contributing to what? Overall text meaning. Okay, so where do they live? So now we have to do what? We have to be using inference. We have to be thinking about, going below the surface of the text, using what's implicitly mentioned to make sense. So we're moving from literal to more inferential understanding. And then last but not least, what we want all of our students walking away with is an overall representation of the meaning. And so inference all along the way is contributing here, if in fact that is our goal. So what does this story teach us about? Right? So big idea, enduring understanding. Now, if I referenced the comprehension house, right, if we just take a moment of that, if you take a look at the comprehension house, we see these different critical components, contributors that I've been talking about. You might be saying, wait a minute, where's inference? Where's the tie to inference? Well, the tie certainly is to levels of understanding, moving from surface to mental model, moving from literal to inferential. It also has something to do with these critical understandings, which has everything to do with what do we take away that allows us to understand other texts, situations, and so on. All right. So what I wanted to do then is, first of all, make a connection to the complexity of comprehension and how inference plays a role. And we looked at our theoretical models and our visual metaphor. And then I wanted to make a connection to the reader and what happens with the reader. Well, what happens with the reader is that they have to use these varied processes. And we've just talked about the language processes. We could also talk about cognitive processes, such as thinking about the idea units, microprocessing, all right, integrating those idea units, integrative processing, all right, elaborative processing, incorporating background knowledge, and then macro processing, the big idea or the mental model, right? So critical understandings underlying as well, so connections too. All right. So let's take a look then at this whole idea of the text base, where inference really begins to play an important role, and then we'll move to the mental model. So this level of understanding, working at this text base that I just talked about, right, takes the reader beyond the words and sentences on the page, right? So it helps to preserve the meaning. Constructing that text base, what requires that the reader understand how the words are combining into these idea units called propositions, and then how they work in combination to convey that underlying meaning of the text. So the author assumes that the reader will recognize these connections, will integrate background knowledge to understand what is implied. So they're using different types of inferences, necessary inferences to integrate ideas and to incorporate background knowledge to understand what is lying below that surface of the text. At the heart of this process, working at the text base and then the mental model, is inference generation, right? And Kane and Oakhill suggest that inference ability is not a byproduct of comprehension, but should be considered a plausible cause of reading comprehension ability. That's a really important statement. So yes, all of these things are contributing, but if in fact we're going to go below the surface, if in fact we want our students to have a depth of understanding, what is it they're going to have to be able to do? They're going to have to be able to integrate information within and between sentences and to incorporate background knowledge, specific knowledge, in order to infer what it is that the author is assuming we will take away from the text. All right. So now I want to be thinking with you about yet another question, right? And this question has to do with what do we know about inference itself and what types of inference contribute to comprehension? So you might want to think about doing a quick write, scripting for yourself some ideas about inference as we have this conversation. So here we have, whoops, I gave you the answer, didn't want to do that. All right, here we have a quick write. And if you're using your participant guide, you might just want to jot down 2 or 3 words that come to mind when you think about what inference is. In other words, you know, where's the Velcro? Surface your background knowledge. All right, so typically when I ask educators to share with me their knowledge of inference, sometimes what they will share are words like read between the lines or fill in the gaps. Those are common ways in which we describe inference. We're going to go a little bit beyond that today. But yes, those would be appropriate. Sometimes what gets described or what surfaces is different types of inferences like prediction. And that is one category that we could be thinking about, or one way in which we use inference to work through text. All right. But here's a description that I think is a little different. Maybe not for all of you, but perhaps for some of you. All right. And so this comes from the work of Kendiao and colleagues. Read with me as we think through what this says. Identification of meaningful relationships between the various parts of the text. What does that mean? And between those parts and the reader's background knowledge. Well, I'm hoping as you were reading that with me, you began to think about some of what I've been saying about that integration within and between sentences, between the various parts of the text, and the incorporation of background knowledge to go even deeper into understanding. All right. So that leads us to that definition, that description leads us to surfacing what the literature has told us about necessary inferences, right? And I know you heard me use the term coherence, local coherence, when we were talking about those levels of language processing. And you might be wondering, where did that come from? Well, here's where it came from, right? When we take a look at the literature, what the literature says to us is, all right, if we want 2 very broad categories of inference, we can talk about, first of all, local coherence inferences. That's that integration from adjacent pieces of text. And we can talk about global coherence inferences, probably the ones you're most familiar with, that are used to fill in the details not expressly stated, needed to construct kind of this global or globally coherent representation. For instance, inferences about themes, morals, bigger picture. Think enduring understandings, think critical understandings, which we mentioned a few moments ago. Now, I thought it just might be important before I progressed any further, just to do a quick lexicon check, all right? Because here I'm talking about coherence, and I'm wondering if all of you are sharing an understanding of what that means. So here we talk about, and this is from really at the Common Core State Standards from the organization that worked on those. They talk about text coherence referring to the logical connections that readers or listeners perceive in written or oral text. One idea leads to another, all right? And also this idea that students have to bring their knowledge base. They have to meet the author halfway, because you know the author never tells you everything. So this is the beginning of understanding how ideas stick together, how they're linked in a logical way, and how one thing connects to the other, how these ideas and relationships presented within the text work together. So when the text is not coherent, wow, the reader has to do a lot of inferring. They have to fill in a lot of the gaps because the author hasn't written in a cohesive manner. We're hoping that the texts that we work with our students, for the most part, are quite coherent, right? And so when we talk about inferencing, we can talk about making sense of how things work together, you know, at a sentence level and then within the overall text, all right? So let's dive into then an understanding of what local coherence inferences are, right? And I'm just going to give you a moment to read what's here in the box. The information is provided by, read that to yourself. All right. So you might have remembered that I said the surface code, all right, of the text are the exact words and syntax, exactly what the author has provided in terms of word and sentence. So this type of inference, this text-based, we have to look at those words, we have to look at the sentences, and we have to begin to think about how do we bridge the ideas or concepts between those sentences or within the sentence as well, right? And we do that through the use of something called cohesive devices. These are the bridges for sentence comprehension. So here I'm going to be talking about inference really for the most part at that sentence level. These inferences, or this category of inference, is necessary, all right? And it's often automatic. So most readers, all right, this will not present as a difficulty, but it does for poor comprehenders. So one of the things that Kane and O'Kill have told us is that when we think about the processing of text, all right, one of the problems that poor comprehenders often have is that integration of ideas within and between sentences. All right. So let's take a moment then. If cohesive devices are the way in which our students or we as readers bridge ideas within and between sentences, let's think a little bit what these things are. All right. And so they're used to signal relationships. They're syntactic and semantic in nature, in other words, grammar-based and meaning-based, right? And they're necessary for understanding these ideas within the text. What are they, all right? Well, there's two types of cohesive devices, right? One type is the cohesive tie, and I'm going to talk about that now and give us some opportunity to work with cohesive ties. So cohesive ties take their meaning from another part of the sentence. They are pronoun reference. I'll show you an example in a moment. They are repetition of a word. They are substitution synonyms, and then something called ellipsis. But let's dive a little deeper into this. Okay. So what might we, whoops, a little too fast. What might we consider as we design effective instruction for bridging and integrating meaning within the text? In other words, what is it that our students need to understand. We need to as well, right? And then how do we go about working with these cohesive devices, specifically cohesive ties with our students? Well, we have to directly teach them what they are. Now, there's more than what you see represented here, all right? But these are some of the more common ones. Now, keep in mind, they're going to signal relationships within and between sentences. And I've provided some examples for you here in the right-hand column from the one and only Ivan, all right? And I've provided some definitions here of these types of cohesive, these are ties. They take their meaning from one part of the sentence or another part of the sentence. So in a pronoun referent, the author uses a pronoun to refer to a word found before or after in the text. So people call me the freeway gorilla, all right? The one and only Ivan, and it goes on to say, these are not mine, I am Ivan. So mine and I are pronoun reference. And the question would be, who's mine, right? Who's I? Oh, it's Ivan. All right, so this tying up, how the author uses different words to represent the same meaning. All right, substitution synonyms, the author replaces a word or group of words in the text. So again, you see the example, people call me the freeway gorilla, the one and only Ivan, the silverback gorilla. Those are all substitutions. Who's the silverback gorilla? Oh, it's Ivan. Who's the freeway gorilla? Oh, it's Ivan, all right? So you could see in the first example, more of a syntactical connection. In the second example, more of a semantic or meaning connection. And then sometimes a repetition. And so you see, for instance, I am Ivan, just Ivan, and so on. So the repetition of Ivan, and sometimes the ellipsis in which the author omits one or more words, and you have to go back to figure out, you tell me which ways are more fun, and you have to understand and use the context of the text in order to respond to that. All right. So instruction then, all right, directly teach these, all right. Where does this fit in an overall picture of reading comprehension? Because remember, I wanted to say to you from the very beginning that inference is one part of, and when we think about the contributors, they're interrelated. So here we have inference contributing where at a sentence comprehension level, right? So this is the blueprint, all right? It is an overall master plan or guide for instruction. It is not a unit organizer or a lesson plan. It is based in the evidence, right? It's something that I have devised based on my knowledge of the research, the evidence, the literature, right? What you see on the left-hand side here are varied contributors to what? Constructing comprehension. So this is the reading comprehension blueprint, helping students make meaning of text, right? You'll notice that these contributors look very much like what was represented in the comprehension house, but also those levels of language processing. Here I'm talking about language structures. Oh, I think that was a strand of the reading rope, all right? But I'm focusing on sentence comprehension here. Phrases, clauses, sentence comprehension. The first part of the questions that I'm posing for educators to consider has everything to do with working with the construction of the sentence, understanding the sentence, and so on. The second part of this has everything to do with that integration of ideas. Because if we're going to understand sentences one by one, adding up to the gist of the text, then we have to understand the integration. So I propose that when we think about overall planning, all right, when we think about connections of inference to instruction, that we think about it within the context, this local coherence inferencing in the context of sentence comprehension, right? And that the questions we should be asking ourselves include, how will we, you, I, facilitate the integration of ideas within and between sentences, the use of what? Cohesive ties and connectives. I didn't get to connectives yet. How and when will you teach your students to work with these? Right. So a focus on then here within the blueprint, making a focus or making a connection to inference with how at that local coherence level. All right. So let's see if we can answer the questions. How and when will you teach students to work with these? We've defined them. We know what they are. We certainly have to directly teach that. But we also can have an instructional routine that allows for us to work within the text itself, particularly with those students who are struggling with comprehension, or with our proficient readers, we can just do some checks to make sure that they're understanding how these sentences relate to one another. So I'm going to show you some application to this routine, and the routine you can find in the facilitator guide. We're going to identify the targeted words and phrases in the text. Remember, we were just talking about Ivan, and I did that in the examples, all right? We're going to frame a question or task. Can you find a word that stands in for, that refers back to? And then we're going to do some search for clues or connections and make them visual or verbal. And you see some visualizations here that one might use. You might use an arrow to connect up the substitutions. You might underline the pronoun reference. You might box, I didn't get there yet, the connectives, okay? So you want to directly teach your students how to go about doing this. And of course, this is your instructional routine, but you want them to internalize for themselves this ability to find these connections within the text, right? So in the upper right-hand corner, what you see is the routine again repeated in this instance. This is the mystery of the tattooed mummy from National Geographic Kids, right? And the teacher identifies the targeted word or phrase that happens to be 20-something woman. And then the teacher is going to go about doing what? We as the educators would be modeling. We'd frame a question, we'd do the search, we'd make the connections. Now, I want to make another point here. You might have noticed that thus far, I've used examples from text as I've been talking about these various aspects of inference. I do not view the teaching of any one of those contributors to comprehension, whether you're talking about vocabulary, sentence comprehension, building of background knowledge, text structures, or asking questions at these different levels that include inference. I do not view these as isolated skill and drill or isolated strategy, right? This is done within the context of age and grade appropriate text with our students. Yes, we can begin with our decodable text, but then we want to build to and move to, perhaps they're listening if they don't yet have the word recognition, to age and grade appropriate text. So they're building these language processing and skills. They're building the knowledge that's necessary to work with academic text. All right. So let me just further explain then here, pronoun reference, right? So our target is 20-something woman. So what I'm going to model then, or you would be modeling for your students is, can I find words that refer back to, all right, 20-something woman? Are there some other words here that mean the same thing? And of course, we would do this in a cumulative way. We wouldn't introduce everything all at once. So the focus here would be pronoun reference. All right, so looking through and beginning to ask myself, where did this something woman fit in? Was she a queen? Oh, she. I think she is a pronoun. It means the 20-something woman. And then I could keep going. When visiting her people, whose people? Oh, the 20-something woman, and so on. So doing the verbalizations, modeling, and then of course, checking in using the underlining with one student. So you can see she, and you see her, and her, and her, and connecting that questioning that allows for the students to see, that's what they need to be doing if in fact they don't understand, right? Or you need to be asking them as you work with text with them. All right. Same thing is true of synonyms or substitutions. What one sees here, the teacher identifies the target, all right, and then frames the question and it searches for and makes the connections. So in this case, same text, all right. It wouldn't have to be the same text. I just did that for facility here for ease. But I'm using 20-something woman again. And my question this time is, what's standing in for? What's substituting for? And again, modeling, all right, for the student. Was she a queen? Oh, who is the queen? Oh, I guess it's the 20-something woman, right? The warrior princess. Oh, they mean the 20-something woman, and so on. And so you see here, not underlining, but the use of arrows. And again, the coding system just needs to be consistent up to the individual, the instructor, the teacher. So you see that I've highlighted these for you as well. So a warrior princess, Moche VIP, star, most elite figures, and so on. My arrows may not be as precise as one would like, but I think you get the idea. All right, here's a practice for you. All right, this is in your guide. Take a moment and practice. And you can identify in this practice, up to you, either the pronoun reference or the substitution synonyms, or both if you'd like. Just take a moment. And if you don't have the practice guide handy, just use what's on the screen. So it's a quick practice. And if you just find a few, Stalin was obviously the target word. That's why it's underlined. All right. So you might have found, and I've underlined and highlighted in blue, I didn't use the arrows this time. You see his and his and he and his, and then you see outstanding student, right? And then you see the unquestioned boss and so on, right? So I'm hoping you're getting a sense of that sometimes this is problematic for our students and important that we probe, we question, and then we directly teach when our students are experiencing difficulty with this. All right. Now, the other type of cohesive device, remember these were ties, are connectives, which you more often think of as conjunctions or adverbs, and they signal relationships, right? And I'm just going to go rather quickly here with you in terms of connectives, because I think we're all pretty familiar with conjunctions, all right? But before we do that, here's a truth or fib, right? And this comes from the work of Kane and Nash, I believe. And the presence of an appropriate connective between two clauses leads to faster reading time, better memory, higher ratings of textual coherence, and facilitates inference making when the relationship between events is not explicitly stated. Do you think truth or fib? So I think we're posting a poll, and let's see how you respond to this. Oh, yes, and of course, yeah. So I think I've given you a few clues along the way. Yeah, all right. Very nice. Okay, very, very nice. All right, in a moment, we'll close the poll. Yeah, so absolutely, this is the truth, all right? It's coming to us directly from the literature in terms of appropriateness of teaching connectives. All right, so let's close the poll and let's move on. Okay. All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that participation. So here are the cohesive devices, the connectives, which we typically think of as conjunctions. And we need to teach these to our students, directly teach again, but we need to teach meaning, all right? And so I know that oftentimes we're doing this for writing, but I think very, very important that we keep in mind that we also have to do this for what? We have to do this for comprehension, for reading comprehension. And so teaching the meaning, and I will tell you that the research that Rawson and Lasso have done with students who are EL students, they strongly recommend that we teach these meanings as part of a vocabulary that their students need in order to make sense of sentence. Okay, so connectives vary in complexity and frequency. Generally, children produce a range by age 5. Connectives expressing additive relations are generally acquired first, and then connectives which express temporal, causal, and aversive relations are acquired. So there is somewhat of a developmental sequence. It's very difficult to come up with developmental sequence for most things in comprehension, but this is one in which you can give some thought to this, right? So thinking about the type of relationship that they actually convey, whether it's addition, whether it has to do with time, whether it has to do with cause, whether it has to do with contrast, whether it has to do with condition. And then, of course, one would want to model. So in a moment, you're going to see the boxed words are connectives. This is, again, that selection from The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy. Each signals a relationship with words that come before and after. They indicate when, time, what, a change in thinking, and what's connected. And so again, the reading of, the working through, the out loud thinking, all right, the think aloud, and having discussion then with students about, as we work with each of these, what are they signifying? So after has to do with time, all right? As has to do with time, so does when, and has to do with additive. And so this is probably around third grade level reading, but as students advance certainly into the upper grades, they would seek conjunctions that are much more complex. So I wanted to give you an opportunity for practice, and this is a little bit more complex. This comes from an article called The Sit-In Movement, published in the Smithsonian Magazine. It might be something you would be using with students in upper grades in middle school or even beginning high school. Take a moment and see if you can find the connectives and what they're signifying in terms of meaning. Again, in your participant guide. So there they are. If, oh, that's a condition. Before, that's time. And then but, condition, or even adversative, dependent upon the context. Okay. All right, so here's a quick check. Let's see how much you've understood. Here's a check for understanding. Take a moment, again, your participant guide, and kind of think through how you might fill in the blanks here. Ideas within and between sentences are connected through the use of. These include cohesive. And then find the cohesive devices that represent Ruby. So just taking a moment. Oops, sorry. So ideas are connected to the use of cohesive devices, right? So they're the bridge, all right? Cohesive ties, substitutions, pronoun reference, and so on, connectives, conjunctions. And then if we went through this little selection that comes out of Ruby Bridges, all right, we sat there and prayed. Ruby would be our target, would be what? She was a good girl. The pronoun she, her, who is she? Who is her? Oh, it's Ruby. Credit to her own people. Who's the credit? Oh, it's Ruby. And there's credit again. All right. All right. So we're about to consider the other category of necessary inference. All right. And it happens to be global inferences. So here's your next poll, truth or fib. Mm-hmm. All right, we'll give this just another few seconds. All right. So we're somewhat split here, although the majority is saying this is the truth. But some people are still thinking about, global inferences. And I know this terminology is probably new to you, all right? So we're going to stop sharing now the poll, and I will say to you, all right, this is the truth, all right? So it is local coherence inferences that are very dependent upon the syntactic and semantic signals, all right? When we come to global, more filling in the gap, the ones that you tend to think of, I think, when you think of inferences, it's very dependent upon meaning, knowledge networks. Yeah. So language, again, it's really that background knowledge, the topical knowledge that one brings to the task. All right. So we talked about local. Now we're talking about global. Global used to fill in the details, right? We cannot make a global inference if we don't have background knowledge. It won't work if we don't have specific domain knowledge. We can teach strategies, as I've often said, to the cows come home, but without background knowledge, and the use, the incorporation, this will not happen. So global coherence inferences, we need to directly teach our students that they'll be working with inferences that are knowledge-based, that they have to surface, they have to connect, that the knowledge will help them fill in the gaps and will make these ideas hang together in an organized way, right? So this type of inference does establish the connections in text, but also links with the mental model, that overall understanding. So the explicit information in the sentences, the surface code, now we're going to what that text base, it's supplemented, it's by the incorporation of background knowledge. So we need to directly teach. And Willingham said this to us: comprehension demands background knowledge because language is full of semantic breaks in which knowledge is assumed, and therefore comprehension depends on making correct inferences. I will tell you that poor comprehenders also have difficulty with this. Again, Kane and Oakhill telling us about text processing skills. Poor comprehenders have difficulty with the integration and the incorporation. Sometimes they have the background knowledge and they don't access it. Sometimes they make fewer incorrect, right? Sometimes they do not recognize the need for an inference, but rather just keep on reading. So this is a problem also for poor comprehenders, right? And when we think about the necessity of background knowledge, we can think about this understanding of the big idea. And so if we just recognize different types of texts or different texts that our students might be reading, like Benjamin Banneker, maybe around 2nd, 3rd grade, The Mystery of the Tattooed Mummy, maybe around 3rd or 4th grade, Tuck Everlasting, maybe around 4th or 5th grade, Founding of an American Democracy, maybe 6th, 7th grade, a mix of both narrative and informational texts, that in order to get to the enduring understanding, the critical understanding, they have to have this background knowledge. So thinking a little bit about, if you know Benjamin Banneker, you wouldn't understand his relevance as an astronomer, but also his courage in speaking out against slavery unless you understood the time frame in which he lived, the time of Thomas Jefferson, and he actually was a free man, a free Black man. Mystery of Tattooed Mummy, it's all about a female mummy, the role of women and the significance of mummification in that ancient society is really important to understanding that particular selection. I only shared a little piece of it. Understanding society's beliefs and attitudes toward immortality. Right, Tuck Everlasting is all about immortality and that secret spring that if you drink of it, immortality is guaranteed. And then, of course, a historical perspective is necessary to understand how important the work was of the founding fathers, but also how difficult it was in order to incorporate all perspectives, right? So let's think a little bit about how you use global inferences. Let's do a quick write, all right? And again, I'm going to ask you to be thinking about this and referencing your participant guide. So just do a few quick write. All right, so I'm sure as I talked about global inferences, you were probably thinking to yourself, where's understanding the cause? Where's predicting? Where's identifying setting? Where's identifying motives and beliefs and traits? How about character relationships or conclusions or view or bias? Yeah, all of these are types of inferences that we make, all right, based on this larger category. And I'm sure there are other ones that you came up with. So we use inference for multiple purposes. And our questions, these different questions that we use at an inferential level, target different aspects of the text, do they not? All right. So I thought I'd just give you a few examples of ways in which we use global inferences. So beginning with picture books, Frog Goes to Dinner, you know, even little ones can come up with inference, basic inference, all right, but they can come up with inference. And using the cover picture on that read aloud, right, who do you think brought the frog to dinner and why? Yeah, well, we can use a picture, can't we? And look at the little guy, and we soon can imagine who brought that frog to dinner. or identifying setting. And we've already talked a bit about this, the one and only Ivan, right? I live here because I'm too much gorilla, not enough human. My domain is made of thick glass, rusty metal, rough cement, and so on. Where's the gorilla and how do you know? And of course, you'd probably need a little bit more of this text. It's a zoo and a mall, believe it or not, all right? And then understanding cause. And you've already seen something about Stalin and a brutal legacy, something we'd probably use 8th grade, 9th grade. And the question being, why was Stalin so fearful? And of course, we'd have to understand his actions as a dictator and the fact that, you know, he really feared for his life for good reason because of his brutal activities. All right. All right. So again, we have to get to this very important question. All right. This is all background knowledge. We need to explain to our students what are our global inferences. We need to be targeted in terms of why we're using inferences. So what are the different types? What are the kinds of questions we're asking that require inference? And then we can be thinking about, well, how do we go about teaching our students to do this? All right. And so I'm going to come back to the blueprint again and make a connection for you. So you might have recalled in instructing the comprehension house, I pointed this out before, different levels of understanding, all right? And so of course we ask our students questions about constructing meaning, all right, at different levels of understanding, right? And so questions we could be asking ourselves as we design overall instruction, right? How will you teach students to construct meaning at different levels of understanding? Surface, text-based, mental model. How will you directly teach? And notice I've incorporated it again, how to integrate ideas and connect background knowledge, there we go, to text. How will you support your students' deep comprehension of text? So this includes inference, right? So how might you do that? Well, here's some general strategies that are going to feel very familiar to all of you because these are the strategies that we know that the research, the literature has in fact validated for us. We know how important questioning is. We know how important visual and textual clues are. Graphic organizer, think alouds. Some of these I've already demonstrated as we've been having this conversation. And then something that I call combination combos, all right? So all of these strategies also somewhat embedded when I talked about local coherence inferencing, right? All of these strategies are valuable. So what does this look like then in the context of inference, all right? Well, in the context of inference, we can now talk about, yet again, an instructional routine, which of course we would want to model. And what you see here is the way in which the teacher would model an instructional routine for identifying whatever the focus is for inference, and then what the reader might be doing. So let's just focus on our role for a moment. So in terms of using the text, we would identify and prepare the text, a picture. You saw me use a picture with Frog Goes to Dinner and a question. You saw me ask some questions, framing inferential questions and prompts, all right, for each one of those examples I just shared. And then I would want to model strategies, activities, clues that would prompt integration of background knowledge, because without background knowledge, this is not going to happen. And then model response to whatever the questions and prompts are. So once again, I'm going to share some examples for you. So this example happens to be Benjamin Banneker, right? So I've selected some text. Happens to be the story of Benjamin Banneker, a free Black man who was an astronomer, but also an advocate, or some might say a revolutionary, because he directly wrote to Thomas Jefferson challenging his viewpoints about slavery, right? The question I framed is, and this is an inferential question, right? I'll have to search for the clues within the text. What do we know about Benjamin Banneker's personality? So remember, this is a type of inference that we might be, what are his beliefs, his motives, his goals, and so on. So I might model some things I know about this character, and I would cite from the text. Some things I have heard the character say, and I would cite from the text. Some things I know the character has done, citing from the text, and any other things. And this would then allow for me to say, wow, I know that this was a courageous person, that he was an advocate. Well, maybe a younger child might say, wow, he really wanted to change things and he was brave, right? He was a revolutionary in many ways. Okay. All right. Another way of doing this might be to take a look at the story of Ruby Bridges, all right? And I think that this example is in your participant handout, so if you want to follow along. And so one of the things that you would want to do is identify your text. In this case, it's going to be the story of Ruby Bridges, but I'm going to use pictures again. And so the teacher is going to select and prepare historical images of the Montgomery bus boycott to accompany the text about Rosa Parks. And then what will I be doing? I'll be framing that inferential question or task. So these pictures were taken on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. They're connected to the story of Rosa Parks. So I'm telling my story and I have my pictures displayed. What do you notice about the passengers on the first bus? Who is sitting in the rear of the bus, right? And so I would be talking to myself about this and saying, wow, I'm noticing that in this picture, it looks to me like all of the individuals of color are sitting in the back of the bus and individuals who are white are in the front. How about the person in the second picture? Okay, well, the person in the second picture is Rosa Parks. Where is she sitting? Oh, she's sitting in the front of the bus. And then I might have asked the question, why? Now what I have to do is model that integration of knowledge, right? All right, the people in the back of the bus are all African-American. I know that they had segregation laws in the South in the 1950s. African-Americans did not have the same rights as white people. For example, they had to sit behind, right? But in the second picture, she's sitting in the front, right? Why is she doing this? I think she's doing this purposefully and protesting a law that she does not feel is fair. So again, I would have to incorporate the background knowledge. I would also include the fact that many people were actually beginning to protest against how unfair these laws were. All right. Here's yet another example that I call a combination platter. Okay, this is a combo. So remember that embedded within this routine is questioning. It can be the use of picture. It can be the use of searching, showing think alouds how you search for the clues. You also can use graphic organizers. Here's a graphic organizer that kind of combines a lot of things. And this is really based on a study that Elbro and colleagues did a while back with middle school students who had the background knowledge or had some of it and didn't surface it, didn't make the connections. And so this would be a scaffolded way of getting students to recognize that what they know about, they have to integrate and connect. All right. And so the question here is, there's the question, why was Stalin fearful for his life? And now it says, so we're going to go right to the book. All right. We're going to look for the clues. All right. But in addition to that, I know. So I'm going to surface some of my background knowledge, and then I'm going to be able to make a conclusion. So he was a forceful personality, a loudmouth bully. He had a ruthless disregard for others. He wiped out a generation of Bolsheviks as well as 20 million others. A career of rebellion, crime, and radical politics eventually made him the unquestioned boss. Wow. Okay. So all of this background, very simply, he ruled through fear and terror. All right. So I can come to some conclusion then. My question, it says I know, and then some type of inference that I can make, a conclusion in this case. All right. So I'm going to give you an opportunity, because all throughout, I hope you've been noticing that there's a lot of explicit teaching inferred here. I do, we do, you do. All right. So directly teaching, directly explaining, modeling, using instructional routines, strategies, activities, using the text. All right. And then opportunity for practice. So I want to give you a quick opportunity for practice as well. So I think you should have available to you. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, available to you this very short selection, which has to do with grasshopper, so informative text. And the question is, why might you not hear the grasshopper when you were older? All right. And so that's my question. It says, all right, so there it is for you to quickly read. You know, all right, so you're going to bring forward your background knowledge. So I think or you think. All right, take a moment. All right. So I think you probably are very capable of, and this was not so difficult for you to come up with the think as to why you might not hear the grasshopper when you're older. And we all know about acuity in terms of our hearing and what we're able to hear as we are able to get older. So
Hi.
Sorry, I didn't have my phone turned off, and so
I'll be back.
All right, yeah, that was just a little bit of an interruption. I apologize. I thought I had turned that off. Okay. So anyway, this high-pitched sound and acuity and so on. So I think, okay, all right, okay. So here's just a little bit more. One of the individuals I wanted to point out to you that I think is well worth reading and finding her article. She does a great deal of research. She's at Middle Tennessee State University. Her name is Amy Elliman. She's written with other authors as well, meta-analyses, and she has some very fine articles about inference. And what we see represented here on the left-hand side are some of the strategies that she's looked at in terms of the meta-analyses of research. And what we have here on the right-hand side are those things that are meaningful, that are particularly meaningful for students as they move through the grades, that they practice answering or generating inferential questions during or after reading, that they're taught how to use clues in the text to construct a coherent representation. They're explicitly taught how to use their relevant background knowledge, that graphic organizers are used to make the text structure clear, all right? Inference is taught by breaking down inferences into subcategories and practicing each skill, all right? And that they learn to connect these ideas through self-explanation. So all of these things are valuable, are based in the science, and some of them I've tried to highlight here for you today. So here's our final quick check, okay? Check for understanding. The information in the text has to be supplemented with. It is used to blank in the gaps. And what is required to answer this question? Why was Benjamin Banneker considered a revolutionary? So take a moment and by all means use your participant guide. So of course, it has to be supplemented with background knowledge, absolutely essential. I often talk about the ABCs, activating and assessing what it is that your students know, and then the B, building, and then the C, connecting, right? And of course, this type of inference has everything to do with filling in those gaps. And what's required, knowledge of the context. A free African-American man living in the 1700s challenged Thomas Jefferson on his viewpoints on slavery. So I'm hoping that as we had this conversation, this discussion, that you were able to surface what it is that you currently do, what you know, make connections to inferencing, its contribution, recognizing that it's a critical competency for proficient reading, necessary to create coherent representations of meaning, all of the ideas hanging together in a meaningful way, necessary for the student, the ultimate goal of comprehension, to walk away with this coherent overall understanding, this mental model of the text itself that can be applied, that can be used in future setting. I'd ask that you just think a little bit about what your inference, what your insight from today. And last but not least, let me say this. I really want to express my gratitude again to everyone at Patton, but particularly to each of you. I hope I've affirmed. I hope I've given you some ideas for acknowledging perhaps further study and action. And last but not least, I hope you recognize how much I appreciate each and every one of you being with me here today. All right, so we're ready to respond to questions. If there are questions or comments, I'm hoping you were all sharing with one another.
Yes, thank you, Nancy, for, as always, so much information, wonderful presentation. We're so appreciative.